When I moved into my son's beautiful new home, I thought it was the start of a peaceful chapter in my life. But on the third evening, as I tried to join their laughter in the living room, my daughter-in-law looked straight at me and said, "Could you please be quiet?" My son didn't defend me. I smiled, my heart breaking quietly. They had no idea that the deed to this house still bore my name, and when the time came, I would walk out with my voice, and the property papers they thought I had forgotten. When I stepped into Daniel's new house, the scent of fresh paint and polished wood made me feel like I was walking into a magazine cover. My son's smile was warm, his arm around my shoulders, and for a moment, I truly believed this was going to be the peaceful home I had longed for. At 63, a retired literature teacher and a widow for nearly 10 years, I had grown accustomed to living alone. Selling my old house hadn't been an easy choice, but the cost of maintenance had become too much. Daniel insisted, "Mom, it just makes sense. We have space, and Melissa and I want you here. You'll be comfortable." It sounded perfect. For weeks before the move, I pictured myself in a cozy guest room upstairs, maybe even with a window overlooking their neat suburban garden. I imagined breakfast with my family, reading by the fireplace, and perhaps finally feeling the comfort I had missed since my husband's passing. But when moving day arrived, I was shown a small room on the ground floor, tucked just beside the garage. "It's closer for you," Daniel said gently, "so you don't have to climb the stairs." The words made sense, but the space felt more like a converted storage room than the welcoming guest suite I had imagined. I told myself not to overthink it. After all, they were offering me their home. I should be grateful. The first few days passed quietly. Melissa was pleasant enough, asking about my favorite teas, showing me where things were in the kitchen, and complimenting my home-baked bread. But I noticed subtle lines in her tone, little cues I wasn't meant to miss. Daniel was busy with work, always distracted, yet genuinely kind when we had a moment alone. He would ask if I was settling in, and I always smiled and said yes. Still, I could sense something just beneath the surface, an unspoken tension that neither of us addressed. My first dinner in their home should have been a warm celebration. Melissa prepared pasta and opened a bottle of wine. Conversation was polite but oddly formal. We talked about Daniel's job, Melissa's yoga classes, even the new neighbors. Then, in a tone that seemed wrapped in sweetness, Melissa said, "I hope you're comfortable here, Helen. I know it's just temporary until you figure out what works best for you." I felt my fork pause mid-air. Temporary? I brushed the thought aside, telling myself she probably meant I'd adjust and perhaps make plans of my own later. I smiled, assuring her I was perfectly comfortable. Later that evening, I overheard Melissa talking to Daniel in the kitchen. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "She's fine here for now, but we'll have to think about the long term." The words clung to me as I lay in bed that night. My little room by the garage was quiet except for the faint hum of the water heater. I told myself not to read too much into it. I was family. I had given up my house, my space, to be with them. Surely there was no ill intent. Still, something about Melissa's phrasing stayed with me. She was careful, deliberate, and while she smiled at me during the day, I began to wonder if her hospitality had invisible boundaries. In the days that followed, I noticed more small things. When I made tea in the kitchen, Melissa would glance at the clock. When I tried to chat while she cooked, she would smile politely, but her hands never stopped moving, her eyes on the pan. And Daniel, sweet, conflicted Daniel, never seemed to notice the tension or perhaps chose not to. On the fourth evening, I decided to make dinner as a gesture of thanks. I cooked Daniel's childhood favorite, chicken pot pie, and set the table. Melissa thanked me warmly but seemed uneasy, as though my presence in her kitchen upset some quiet rhythm she valued. At dinner, conversation turned to Daniel's work trip. Melissa joked about how peaceful the house would be with just the two of us. Her smile was wide, but there was a flicker in her eyes I couldn't quite place. "Don't worry, Helen, it's just a joke. You know you're welcome for now." for now." Those two words returned again, this time like a faint chill under the table. I laughed softly, unwilling to let the air grow heavy, but inside I felt the tiniest crack form in my sense of belonging. I told myself not to overreact. I was their guest. No, I reminded myself, I was family. This was just the adjustment period, a blending of routines. Melissa had her ways, I had mine, and we would find our balance. But as I walked back to my room that night, the thought came to me, uninvited but persistent, that perhaps I had misunderstood my place here. The evening that shifted, everything started quietly, almost innocently. I had just finished cleaning up my small dinner plate when I heard voices from the living room. Melissa's laughter floated through the hallway, cheerful and open. I smiled, thinking maybe I'd join them for a chat. It had been a long day of them working upstairs, and I was eager for a little company. As I stepped into the doorway, Melissa glanced over her shoulder, her smile faltering just slightly before she spoke. "Oh, Helen," she said in a light, sing-song voice, "we're about to start a video call with some friends from college. It's kind of, private. Would you mind just keeping it down tonight?" Her tone was polite, but her words stung. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to laugh it off or take it as it sounded, a request to disappear from my own shared space. Daniel, sitting beside her, offered me an apologetic smile. "Mom, you understand, right? Just this once." "Just this once," I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course. I'll stay in my room." My voice felt lighter than the weight in my chest. I retreated to my small room by the garage, the faint sound of laughter carrying through the thin walls. I told myself it was fine. It was just one evening. They deserved their privacy. But still, I couldn't shake the thought that I had been politely erased from their night. The next morning, as I passed the kitchen, I overheard Melissa on the phone. Her tone was different, brisk, confident, even amused. "Oh, she's fine," she said. "Think of her as a tenant. She's quiet, keeps to herself. It's temporary." Tenant. I froze just beyond the doorway, my hand still on the counter. A tenant. My mind turned over the word again and again. I wasn't family here, not really. I was someone taking up space until they could figure out a way to move me out. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving. My hands trembled slightly as I made tea. I told myself not to overreact. People said things without meaning harm. But there was a part of me that knew Melissa chose her words carefully. Over the next week, I began to notice patterns. I was not invited to join them for dinner with their friends, or even casual weekend brunches when Melissa's parents came over. I stayed in my room during those gatherings, the muffled sound of clinking glasses and laughter a reminder of my new place in the family hierarchy. New house rules began to emerge, always said in a tone so soft, so civil, it would sound unreasonable to object. "Helen, could you try to use the kitchen before 6? It's just easier for meal prep." "Oh, the upstairs bathroom? We're keeping that for guests, but of course you have the one downstairs." At first, I told myself these were just adjustments. Every household had rhythms. But slowly, I realized these rules were walls being built around me, one polite brick at a time. One afternoon, as I searched for an old photo album in my small wardrobe, I noticed something strange. The little wooden cabinet I kept my personal documents in, the one that had been tucked in the corner, looked slightly out of place. The stack of envelopes inside was arranged differently than I had left them. My breath caught. I always kept my things neat in the same order. Now, some of my old bank statements were on top, my property sale documents tucked lower down. I sat back on the bed, the air suddenly heavy. Someone had been in here. I thought back to Melissa's careful glances when I mentioned my old house, her interest in how much I sold it for, her remarks about downsizing. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air drifting in from the small window. I locked the cabinet that night, my hand steady even as my mind spun. Something was happening, and I wasn't sure what yet. But I knew enough from years of life to recognize when there were conversations happening behind closed doors, and when I was the subject of them. I didn't say a word to Daniel. I couldn't be sure what he knew or how much he was willing to see. But inside, something shifted. I had come into this house believing I was family. Now I began to understand I might be something else entirely in Melissa's plans. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the house felt unusually still, Daniel at work and Melissa moving about in the kitchen. I was in my room folding laundry when I heard her voice, low, measured, but just loud enough to drift through the half-open door. "Yes, Mom," Melissa said, her tone firm. "We just need to get the title completely in our names. Once that's done, she won't have any say." I froze, a sweater clenched in my hands. She won't have any say. The words were sharp, cutting through the quiet. I stepped silently to my door, listening. Melissa's voice lowered further. "Daniel doesn't want to upset her, but this will be better for everyone in the long run. She'll understand once she's settled somewhere else." Somewhere else. I sat back on the bed, my mind racing. I remembered the sale of my old house, the home where Daniel grew up. When Daniel and Melissa bought this place, I had written a check that covered a significant part of the down payment. At the time, it hadn't mattered whose name was on the paperwork. I trusted my son, I trusted his wife, I trusted family. But trust was beginning to feel like a currency I had spent too freely. That afternoon, while Melissa was out running errands, I walked quietly into the small home office off the kitchen. A drawer in the desk wasn't fully closed, papers sticking out just slightly. I hesitated for only a second before opening it. There it was, a copy of the property deed. My eyes scanned the page, my breath catching as I saw my own name printed clearly alongside Daniel's. I wasn't a guest in this house. I wasn't a tenant. I was a legal co-owner. Melissa had been careful not to mention this. I stood there, the page trembling slightly in my hands. A flood of emotions surged through me, hurt at her dishonesty, anger at her presumption, and something else. A quiet, steady realization that I still had power here. I tucked the papers back exactly as I'd found them, my pulse steadying. This wasn't the moment to confront her. Not yet. The next morning, I called a number I hadn't dialed in years. My attorney, Mr. Carter. He had handled the sale of my old home and had always been meticulous, the kind of man who remembered every clause in a contract. "Helen," he said warmly when I explained who I was, "what can I do for you?" I told him everything. How I'd moved in with Daniel and Melissa, the subtle pressures, the talk I'd overheard. I asked him about the deed, my legal standing. He was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Helen, you are still a co-owner of that property. Your signature is required for any transfer of ownership. Without it, nothing can be done." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by unease. "There's more," Mr. Carter continued. "It appears someone, Melissa, I presume, submitted an application to transfer full ownership to herself and Daniel. It was rejected because your signature wasn't included." I gripped the phone tighter. So it was true. Melissa wasn't just making plans. She'd already tried to make them reality. My chest felt heavy, but there was a strange steadiness underneath. I thanked Mr. Carter, asking him to prepare copies of all documents related to my ownership. He agreed, his tone firm. "Helen, don't sign anything without me present, and don't let them pressure you." That night, I sat in my room, the hum of the water heater a quiet backdrop to my thoughts. I looked around the small space, my suitcase tucked in the corner, the stack of books by my bed, the locked cabinet holding my most important papers. I had walked into this house believing I was a guest, but I wasn't just a guest. I was part owner, and now I knew for certain that Melissa's kindness had an expiration date, one she hoped to speed up. I thought of Daniel. How often he avoided conflict, how easily Melissa's voice filled the silence. Did he know what she'd done? Or was he simply looking the other way? For the first time since I arrived, I stopped telling myself this was just a misunderstanding. Melissa wasn't waiting for me to feel at home. She was waiting for me to leave. And if she thought I would go quietly, she didn't know me at all. It was a Thursday morning when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I'd gone to the kitchen early, hoping to enjoy a quiet cup of tea before Melissa came downstairs. The house was still, sunlight filtering in through the blinds, when I heard her voice from the living room. She was on the phone again, her tone sharp and calculated. "Mom, once the deed is in our names, we can sell part of the property or take out equity for the investment. It's a perfect opportunity. But she can't know yet." My fingers tightened around the teacup. It wasn't just about getting me out. It was about using my share of the house for her own plans. I stood there, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I thought of the years I had worked, the sacrifices I had made to give Daniel a good life. That money, that house, was more than bricks and paper. It was my security, and Melissa was planning to dismantle it without a second thought. I stayed silent, stepping quietly back to my room, my mind spinning. I needed to think, to process, but the universe wasn't done with me yet. That evening, I overheard another conversation, this time between Daniel and Melissa. I had gone upstairs to return a book to the shelf when I heard their voices in the bedroom. "Daniel, you know this is what's best for everyone," Melissa said. "Once we sort the ownership, we can make proper plans. Your mother will understand." There was a long pause before Daniel's voice came, quieter, heavier. "I know. I just don't want things to blow up. I can't deal with another argument right now." It was like a knife through me. He knew. He knew about her plans, and he wasn't stopping her. I stepped back from the door, each step heavier than the last. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The warm hope I'd carried when I moved in was gone, replaced by something harder, steadier. I wasn't just a guest being pushed out of a home. I was a co-owner being pushed out of what was legally mine. And now I knew. I had no allies in this house. The disappointment was deep, but so was my resolve. If they thought I would quietly fade into the background, they were wrong. That night, I took out my locked cabinet and spread my documents across the small desk. Property deeds, bank statements, correspondence from Mr. Carter. I checked everything twice, then carefully organized it all into a neat folder. The next day, I visited Mr. Carter again. His expression tightened as I told him what I'd overheard. "Helen," he said, leaning forward, "you have every legal right to protect your share. We can prepare the paperwork for you to withdraw your equity if you choose." My heart thudded in my chest. "And if I do? Then they will have to either buy you out or sell the house to release your portion. They cannot keep the property without compensating you, and I will make sure the process is airtight." I nodded slowly, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. "Prepare everything," I told him. "I want all my documents in order, and I want copies." Over the next few days, I gathered everything. I visited the bank, placing copies of my documents in a safe deposit box. I kept my folder close, hidden in my room where no one would think to look. I moved through the house as though nothing had changed. I smiled at Melissa over morning coffee. I asked Daniel about his work. I even offered to cook dinner one night, making Melissa's favorite roast chicken. But inside, I was no longer the woman hoping to fit in. I was the woman preparing to leave on my own terms, with my dignity and my assets intact. I began planning my exit carefully. The moment had to be right. I wanted them to feel secure, comfortable, unaware of what was coming. And then, at the perfect moment, I would lay everything on the table. The opportunity came in the form of a family dinner, planned for the following week. Melissa wanted to invite a few friends, but Daniel suggested keeping it just between us. "That's perfect," I said, my voice even. "A quiet dinner, just the family." Melissa smiled, completely unaware that I had already asked Mr. Carter to prepare the formal equity withdrawal documents. At that dinner, I wouldn't just tell them I was leaving. I would tell them the house would no longer be theirs alone, and I would watch as the balance of power shifted, one signature at a time. The evening of the dinner came cloaked in the kind of calm that only hides storms. Melissa had set the table with her best china, the wine glasses glinting under the soft light. Daniel sat across from me, looking relaxed, unaware that the quiet night he expected was about to shatter. Melissa poured wine for us all, her smile practiced, her tone as smooth as ever. "Helen," she said sweetly, "I hope you've been comfortable here. But we've been thinking. Maybe you'd be happier somewhere more suited to your age. A quiet community, perhaps, somewhere peaceful." The words were sugar-coated, but they landed like stones. I set my glass down carefully, my hands steady. I smiled. "Melissa, that's very thoughtful of you." Her eyes widened slightly, perhaps expecting a protest. Daniel looked relieved that I wasn't offended. I reached down to the leather bag at my side and placed a thick folder on the table. "Since you've brought it up, this is the perfect time to discuss the arrangements." Melissa's gaze flickered to the folder, confusion clouding her expression. Daniel's brows drew together. "Mom, what's this?" I opened the folder slowly, letting the papers speak before I did. Deeds, contracts, bank statements, everything neatly in order. I slid the top document toward Daniel. "You see, Daniel," I said evenly, "this house isn't entirely yours. I am still a co-owner. Every brick, every room. My name is on the title, and I've decided it's time for me to leave." Melissa's smile froze. "Helen, I think there's some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I interrupted gently. "I've spoken with my attorney. The ownership is clear, and when I go, I'll be taking my equity with me." The room went still. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. Melissa's face flushed, her composure faltering for the first time. I leaned back slightly, my voice calm. "This means the house will no longer be entirely yours. You will either need to buy out my share or sell the house to compensate me." Melissa's fork clinked softly against her plate. "You can't just—" "I can," I said, my tone firm but even, "and I will. The paperwork is already in motion. My attorney will be in touch with you both by the end of the week." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, why didn't you talk to me first?" "I tried," I said softly. "For weeks I tried to believe I belonged here, but I've been treated like a tenant in my own investment, and now I'm taking back my voice and my share." Melissa looked as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. Her carefully woven plans were unraveling in front of her, thread by thread. I closed the folder, slipping the papers back inside. "I'll be moving out next week. I've already made arrangements for a place of my own." Daniel looked stunned, struggling to process the speed and finality of my words. Melissa's voice finally broke through, tight and sharp. "So you're just leaving? Taking the money and walking away?" I met her gaze. "Yes, but there's one more thing you should know." I reached for a smaller envelope tucked in the folder and slid it across the table. "My share of the equity won't be going into another home for me. It will be donated to the Thompson Literacy Foundation, an organization that builds libraries in underserved communities. It's what your father and I always wanted to do." Melissa's face drained of color. Whatever dream she had of using my share for her investments was gone in an instant. Daniel stared at the envelope, his expression torn between pride and regret. "I want nothing from you except peace," I continued. "This way, the money does good in the world, and I have my freedom. We all get what we truly deserve." Silence filled the room, the clink of cutlery, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint ticking of the clock seemed louder in the absence of words. Melissa pushed back from the table, her jaw tight, but she said nothing. Daniel sat still, his eyes on me, perhaps realizing too late the cost of his silence these past weeks. I stood, tucking the folder back into my bag. "Dinner was lovely, thank you. I'll begin packing tomorrow." And just like that, the storm I had kept inside for weeks broke. Not in raised voices or slammed doors, but in the quiet certainty that I was walking away on my terms. A week later, I turned the key in the door of my new apartment. It was smaller than Daniel's house, but it was mine. Every corner, every wall, every inch. The ocean breeze slipped through the open balcony doors, carrying the scent of salt and the sound of distant waves. I set my bag down and walked to the balcony, feeling the air rush over me. Freedom didn't just feel like a place, it felt like breath. For the first time in months, I didn't have to measure my words or watch my steps. The days that followed were quiet but fulfilling. I furnished the apartment to my liking. Soft chairs by the window, shelves of my favorite books, and a small writing desk where I could pen letters or simply watch the tide roll in. The silence here wasn't the heavy, awkward kind I had known in Daniel's house. It was peaceful, chosen, and mine to enjoy. Daniel called after a few days. His voice was careful, tinged with guilt. "Mom, I'm sorry about how things turned out." "I know you are," I replied gently. "I hope you've learned something from all this." "I have," he said after a pause. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have protected you." There was no anger in my voice, only truth. "Sometimes silence costs more than words, Daniel." Melissa never called. I didn't expect her to. Perhaps the loss of my equity and the collapse of her plans had left her unwilling to face me. That was fine. I didn't need her apologies. As weeks passed, I noticed a subtle change in Daniel. When he called, his tone was softer, more reflective. He asked about my health, my hobbies, even the books I was reading. Perhaps the absence of my quiet presence in his home made him think more about the value of respect and what happens when it's taken for granted. Life in my seaside apartment blossomed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I took morning walks on the shore, chatting with neighbors I met along the way. I rediscovered my love for cooking, trying new recipes just for myself. And in a moment of quiet triumph, I made a decision that would seal my independence. I bought a second property, another apartment, this one even closer to the water. The deed bore only one name, mine. It wasn't about luxury, it was about security. A declaration to myself that I would never again depend on anyone's goodwill to feel at home. And with my independence secured, I began to explore a dream I'd kept tucked away for years. I booked a trip, just a small one at first. A few days in Italy, wandering through old bookstores in Rome, sipping espresso at street cafes. One trip became 2, then 3. I began to see the world in ways I'd only imagined when I was younger. Each journey reminded me that my life wasn't over just because I was in my 60s. In fact, it felt like it was beginning again, on my terms. One evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I stood on my balcony and reflected on the path that had brought me here. Kindness, I realized, is powerful, but kindness without boundaries invites harm. Family is precious, but love cannot flourish without respect. I thought of the weeks in Daniel's home, the subtle exclusions, the quiet erasures, the attempts to make me disappear. I had allowed it for a time, hoping it was just a misunderstanding, but I learned something vital. You cannot keep your voice if you're afraid to use it. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the apartment, but the fact that I had spoken up, acted, and refused to let myself be pushed aside. If there's one thing I would tell anyone listening, it's this. Don't ever let anyone make you small in your own life. The people who love you will honor your space. The people who don't will teach you the value of protecting it. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at my hair. I closed my eyes, breathing it in. Tomorrow, I would start planning my next trip. Maybe the Greek islands, maybe somewhere I'd never even considered before. The world felt open again. And as the first stars appeared over the horizon, I smiled to myself. I had taken my voice back, and I would never give it up again.